I'm privileged to have Arturo O'Farrill with me today from New York City, and welcome.
I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be able to be a musician, a pianist, a composer, an educator, an activist, and any chance I get to tell the craziness of what I do is hopefully a chance for someone in the world to go, gee, if an idiot like that can do that, maybe I can do it.
I'm going to focus on the craziness for a moment.
I
Uh,
don't mean an idiot. I mean, I
no,
just
I know what you mean, but I have a prop here. I was going to pull it out later, but um, do,
incredible. Of course, I
yeah.
remember that.
And do you have this, of course, is your father's arrangements on a Basie record. Do you have a memory in a certain age when you realized that your father was not in a normal day gig type job, that maybe his business was a little crazy?
I mean, that presumes that I had an idea of what normality was. Um, for me, normality was Chico. I mean, I remember being probably 4 or 5, and he had a TV show in Mexico, and I remember going with him to a taping, and just I think they, for some reason, a bicycle comes into that memory, whether they were giving me one or had one to give, or I don't know, but I just remember rehearsals and parties and conducting. I remember so many things that didn't seem at all absurd to me. I didn't think twice about having Dizzy Gillespie in my living room. I didn't think twice about the all night crazy parties. I didn't think twice about any of it. That's the world I knew. I didn't really know. I didn't until I was in middle school that I have friends who were not crazy Afro-Cuban jazz royalty, and then I realized that there was a whole slice of life that I didn't know about, where people actually had normal schedules and day-to-day activities in life in a seeming pattern of normalcy.
And you were in New York City by that time, middle school.
We moved to New York City. I thought we moved to New York City when I was 4 or 5, but apparently I must have been 5 or 6.
Okay. I looked at the year 1976 earlier today, wondering what musically was going on. Of course, there was a whole lot. In the rock field, we had Led Zeppelin was still around, and the Ramones, and we had disco, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And jazz was Miles, of course, Return to Forever, Weather Report. Tito Puente was still around. So my question is, when you were 16, 15 or 16, what were you choosing from all this music out there, plus music at home and at the high school that you were at of music and arts? What were you grabbing onto?
Well, I was definitely madly in love with Hymn of the Seventh Galaxy, which is a Chick Corea recording. I must have wore that thing to death. I was also madly in love with Inner Visions, Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions. Um, and I was also madly, I had, by the way, kind of rejected Latin music as there's something about being in New York at that period in my school in that neighborhood that made me uh maybe it othered me being Latino. It othered me being Mexican, being Cuban. And so I ran as far as I could from that part of my father and mother's life. And I embraced Oliver Lake. I embraced Rashid Ali. I embraced, so I had a little group, I think, in 1976 that I was playing with some musicians, Pablo Calogero, and I think some other ones were Marcus Rojas and Hayward Peel. And we had a little group called the Untouchables. And sometimes we called ourselves the Untouchables, sometimes we called ourselves the Afroholics. And it was basically a free jazz groove oriented kind of a lot of the stuff that's very popular now. We were doing back in 1976. And we were playing. We were playing. In fact, that's kind of, I was so busy playing and making music that I think at that point I'd already been ejected from the High School of Music and Art. The High School of Music and Art. Here's exactly what happened too. Um, they didn't have jazz programs. They didn't have jazz education in those days. The only programs they had were in North Texas State and Berkeley. I think UMass were the three programs that taught jazz on any collegiate level. So if you wanted to learn to play jazz, you didn't get it at the Manhattan School of Music. You didn't get it. I was at the prep division, but if you wanted to learn to play jazz, you had to go hang out with old jazz musicians. And lucky for me, there was a place on the Lower East Side called Studio We that was run by a man named James Du Bois. And musicians, older musicians, would go there and hang out all day. People like Cornelia Smith, Jimmy Vass, Clarence Sharp. I mean, these were places that they would just hang out all day long, just jamming, playing, drinking beer, smoking pot, whatever they did. And we would go. I actually think I got kicked out of high school because I didn't go to class. I would go down to I would go to my music classes. I'd go to jazz bands and theory and musicianship, but most of the time I would make my way down to the Lower East Side and hang out with these old musicians and beg them for information. How do you play this chord? How do you play that? What'd you do? How does that? How was that? You know, and every now and then they would give you information, but it was our osmosis. You learned to be a jazz musician by listening intently. I was a Bud Powell freak. I listened to nothing but Bud Powell, and then just by osmosis, hanging out with those older jazz musicians, and then of course we would play any gig we could get. So that was about the age of 16. That was the period of my life, and I didn't embrace anything remotely Latin till years later when I met the great bassist Andy Gonzalez, and he told me that it was important for me to embrace the entry point of my people into the conversation we call jazz.
I think that when I listen, of course, pan Latin music, I've had a lot of trouble knowing where I am. And I've used this excuse with me that, oh, this music you really need to have lived when you were a kid. You need to hear it from the time you're a child to really embrace it. And it's probably not true.
I think it's easier if you've grown up with, I mean, invariably, or undoubtedly, not invariably, undoubtedly, the sound of Latin music was embedded in my DNA. On some level, subconsciously, I did grow up with it. I grew up with Mario Basa and Machito and people like that were constant visitors to my house. And in fact, one of my earliest playing experiences was I was a bicycle messenger, and I love being a bicycle messenger, but it's a hard gig. And one day it was raining, and I must have been about 16 or 17. It was raining. I had hit my knee on a rear view mirror or a side view mirror, and I was just sitting on the side of the sidewalk on the curb, kind of just miserable. And Machito walked by. Machito walked by and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Machito, this is what I have to do for a living." And he said to me, "We can't have this. I'm going to commission your father to write a piece for you. You're going to conduct it in the Monterey Jazz Festival with Dizzy Gillespie." And I kind of looked at him and went, "Yeah, right, whatever." But it actually happened. He actually got me to play at the Monterey Jazz Festival with Dizzy Gillespie as a guest soloist with the Machito Orchestra in a piece that my father wrote for me that was then entitled Junior's Thing and later became entitled Pianitis. But I had the sound of Latin music my entire life. And my entire life, I had the sound of that in the back. So when Andy approached me in my 30s to really teach me about Latin music, I was ready. I was ready to really sit down and really, because Andy did that. He sat me down and played me the history of Latin piano players, from Bola de Nieves to Edsel Gomez and everyone in between. And then I realized that this music that and this is funny because it begs the question: what happens to people who are transcultural, people who are in New York City but can't identify or be identified as either white or black or Latino enough? I mean, this is really strange. People don't think about this, but my name is Arturo O'Farrill. Clearly, there's a problem that if you want to peg me into a nice little tidy little hole, you're not going to be able to. And so, I mean, it was really interesting to me to rediscover the incredible complexity and subtlety of Latin music, that you can't just play. You're absolutely correct. That you can't just pick it up. It's by osmosis. It's by listening to it. It's by understanding it. It's by learning how to play percussion. The great Puerto Rican valve trombonist, not valve trombonist, the great Puerto Rican trombonist, Pablo Vasquez, sat me down and actually had me learn the conga patterns and the timbal patterns, and all of that is really incredibly important. And you use a beautiful word too, because later on, after embracing that Cuban Puerto Rican side of this music, I learned about Peruvian music: festejo, landó, cumbia, vallenato, candomblé. I learned that the music that we call Latin is encyclopedic. There's hundreds of varieties of just bomba and plena in Puerto Rico. And so in a way, I feel like I graduated. And this is not to denigrate jazz, but I feel like I graduated to Latin music.
When musicians like myself, my generation for years, dancers would come up and say, can you play something Latin? And invariably we would think that we're doing the right thing by playing The Girl from Ipanema. Okay.
Of course.
Yeah, we got that covered. and,
Of course.
and it's just stunning. I've learned we've had some guests here over the years, Victor Randone and others that
I know Victor, sure.
Yeah,
Victor
I'm just starting to realize the depth of this. And I was going to bring this up later, but I watched I think it was a quintet or a sextet on a Tiny Desk concert. And the night before I watched it, I was doing a little jazz gig, and okay, it's time for drum breaks. And what do? We go, all right, we're going to play on the downbeat every two measures, and the drummer's going to fill it in. That's a sort of a typical. So on this piece you did called In Whom, when it was time for the drum feature, I'm gonna see if I can pull this off. I tried to notate this thing. Be ba do ba da ba do bop, be ba do ba da da ba dicka dicka da, gee ba dicka dicka da. You were playing that on the piano in octaves. I think the bass player was playing it. Meanwhile, the multiple drummers are playing over the top of it. Is there a question here? I'm not sure, but it's an observation, and it was awesome.
Oh, it's funny. I don't. Sometimes what I do with that section, instead of playing those exact notes, we'll play random pitches. And I mean, it's one of those things where really great drummers in this field, people like Dafis Prieto or my son, Zachary O'Farrill, are able to think in polyrhythmic ways. So that, in other words, they're hearing clave, they're hearing the pulse, they're also hearing the phrase. And so they're hearing in 3, they're hearing in 2, they're hearing in 6. And so they're able to, take these incredibly complex rhythmic voyages and find their way back to the downbeat 8 measures later, because they're able to hear. And that's really, to me, that's a very African way of approaching music. When you think about the cross-stick rhythms of Ghana and the different djembe rhythms in Africa, you realize that they work on multiple levels. They work in two, they work in three, they work in six, they work in these larger entities that are musical phrases, which is amazing to me because sometimes in the hands of the right people, in the hands of Tony Williams, you can also hear this in swing. When Tony Williams takes a solo, I mean, it's not pulse orientation, it's phrase orientation, it's larger entity orientation, and I think that that's what I try to do. That's what I tried. That's an earlier piece. I think I've gotten more sophisticated than that in terms of writing places for drummers to take extended improvisations. But yeah,
I have to say, it's funny that you say that because to me, that was very sophisticated.
it's not your typical drum break. No, it's not your typical drum break. It's a little bit more involved.
There was another moment I saw on your Afro Latin, your large group, live at Birdland, and the first piece you played was by Tito Puente. I'm not sure I could pronounce it. Iko, Iko.
Oh, that's not a Tito Puente piece.
Oh, okay.
That's actually Iko, the New
Well, that's
Orleans
what I thought.
traditional.
And well, your arrangement of it was quite inventive.
Todd Bayshore arranged that piece, but I have to, it's funny because that's actually a piece that we recorded on a record that I love, that I think is my breakthrough artistic moment. It's a record that I made called The Offense of the Drum. And the last cut on The Offense of the Drum is that arrangement of Iko with Donald Harrison. And it's really interesting to me because the thing about that arrangement and about that piece is that we talk a lot about Latin and jazz as being different or cousins, or we keep talking about these things. I think jazz is Latin and Latin is jazz. I think that both are African, and the way to really understand either one is to understand its context in the pan-African diasporic rhythmic practice that ends up coming. Because here's the thing, that diaspora didn't just come to New Orleans. It came to Cuba. It came to Mexico. It came to wherever the enslaved peoples were brought. They brought those rhythms with them. And so that the thing we call jazz is also the thing that we call mambo. It's also the thing we call samba. It's also the thing we call salsa. Because and it's really funny. It's one of those things where a credible argument could be made that all of the music that we love in contemporary Western society, salsa, jazz, hip hop, R&B, it can all be traced to Afro-Yoruban religious rhythms. And I've read, in several cases, there's a Secular Devotion is a book that argues for that theory. In any case, you look at this music and you realize that there's two ways to hear music. You can hear a pulse orientation where you're counting individual beats, or you can, and this is always the way to learn music, by the way. But the grown-ups tend to see music as larger entities of phrase orientation and larger entities. So that when even playing jazz, if you look, I have had this experience 1,000 times in giving clinics, where you have a saxophone section going boo boo doo doo ba doo 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 bop, and they're playing doo ba doo doo ba doo doo bop, and you go, don't play the notes, play the phrase, and the interior mechanism will clean up. And then they do it. They actually go. I have them think about the thing as a continuous line, and I look at that line. I have them play the length, not the interior mechanism, and it tightens them up every time. It tightens them up every time because, the thing that's incredibly beautiful to me about African musical practice is that it is larger than beats. It's larger than beat orientation. If you listen to real African drumming and you'll hear that the pulse can slow up, slow down, speed up, but it's all done in this incredibly cohesive manner that I think is what jazz does when it's at its best. And again, this is not to denigrate jazz or to, I think we just have to cop to the idea that the thing we call jazz is not an invention, but an inheritance of an African musical practice that occurs throughout the indigenous worlds.
At UCLA, you were or still are the professor of global jazz studies. And I wonder if that title, if you were in on that title, because it's not a common thing if you look at other colleges and their jazz department. It stands out that you call it global jazz studies.
I actually created the Global Jazz Studies program first for Brooklyn College, and then when I went to UCLA, they already had a Global Jazz Studies program in place. So a lot of that is the realization that a lot of academia is making about the nature of jazz. And if in the first case, we have to this is not a popular position, but I'll go ahead and state it. Jazz was, we know this, it's a verifiable fact. Jazz is a word that was made up for a concert. It was put on a flyer and it was even denigrated. It was I forget the exact breakdown, but it was a fairly racist trope. Jazz is not an invention. It's not an American invention. It's not. Jazz is something that was formed here by people of African descent. It's a very, very tricky position to take because that same, again, as I said earlier, that same those same forces that fomented the creation of Black music in the Americas happened wherever Black musicians were in the Americas. So to call jazz an American invention is like saying classical music is a Viennese invention. It's actually the work of many people who come together to bring about a very wide definition, of course. And, the ultimate example is Mozart, who is a Viennese, Austrian, German, writing Italian, French music. I mean, it's all kind of that thing, which is, so in a way, jazz is a word that I think people have adopted to nationalize an art form and to affirm themselves in a way that I think is very unhealthy. And I think that the better definition of jazz is also the better definition of what it means to be American, which means to embrace multiplicity. The real definition of America is a nation born out of many, many, many people. The nation was not founded by white Europeans. It was already here with indigenous beings. The indigenous people of the Americas were already here. So the United States is the history of many people coming together to form this union. And that, to me, is what jazz is. Jazz at its best represents the multiplicity of cultures, the transculturation of humanity. We are Irish, we are German, we are Cuban, we're Mexican, we're Scandinavian, we're Puerto Rican. We are all those things. And the best part of the United States is when we don't try to isolate the internationalism. The best part of the United States is not when you're American, but when you embrace all of what America is. And I feel that same way about jazz. Global jazz studies is just a way to understand that Mother Africa filtered the sources. Some of the sources were Middle Eastern, some of them were South Asian, some of them were European, some of them all got together. All of these ingredients came together in Mother Africa, where they cooked and basted and were spiced, and you stirred the pot, and all of a sudden all these influences became a uniquely African event that was then brought to the indigenous world by the horrific cataclysm called the slave trade. And so I think that global jazz studies is very important, because if we think of jazz as invented on August 3rd in New Orleans in 1923, then we've really actually done a tremendous disservice to the real revolutionary and transformative power of this music, which is that it is the music that demands equal voice for all human beings. Jazz is the most revolutionary music that I can think of. And when I think of my heroes, in addition to Carter Bley and Chico O'Farrill, I think of Charles Mingus. I think of people who demanded that the truth tellers, that the truth be told, that Governor Faubus be told, be called out. I think that when I think of my heroes, they're the people who insist that jazz. It's funny. I did a recording with Cornel West that won a Grammy called Four Questions. And I wrote a concerto basically for Cornel West's oratory. And we were backstage at the Apollo at the premiere, and we were talking about jazz, and we were talking about how some people insist that jazz is this, born here, and this is what it is. And we were laughing because it's so different. Jazz is the ultimate revolutionary power of truth telling, bold, unashamed, unembarrassed. The truth demands a telling of the truth. And we looked at each other, and all of a sudden we both, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that sting. He just started laughing.
Were there certain parts of the world where, let's say, the melodic contributions came from? We've been talking mostly about rhythm. What about the melody and the form?
Without a doubt, much of the information that we have in the thing we call jazz comes from European melodicism. It comes from the chromatic harmony. So in some ways, this is funny that you said that, because I was just listening to Isfahan, and I was just listening to Isfahan and Warm Valley, and I was thinking about one of the greatest gifts of music is Duke Ellington's sense of melodicism. Just the pacing and the outlaying of a Duke Ellington melody, to me, is as elegant as anything that Beethoven wrote. And I'm a classically trained musician. My degrees are in classical music. But when I listen to Duke Ellington, I can't help but think, this is classical music. It's you don't have to dress it up. It's already arrived, fully formed, and as eloquent as any Beethoven piano sonata. It's just So yeah, melodically, I think the best when good, and I'm going to say this again, it's not a black or white thing. When musicians embrace aesthetics that are forged in Mother Africa and that are brought forth through the crucible of European harmony and performance practice, these things come together in a way that to me feels global. And then you realize that after this thing has been born, its best expression comes throughout the world. Incredible musicians in Europe and Asia and practitioners of this craft at the highest levels who are all over the world. And you realize then that the word global jazz is talking not only about the beginnings, the contemporary moments of jazz, but also the future of this music. It is, and it's funny because to me, it's like it is very important to understand the migratory power of music. Music is the ultimate migratory power. When we listen to a piece of music, we have to recognize that it comes through a place, but it comes from many sources.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty profound. Thank you for that. I'm envious on a couple levels, but one is that you've written for the dance. And I wonder if in your career before those commissions, if you ever were a pianist for a dance company, just accompanying their workouts and providing music for them to move to.
We were a little stoned out. We were little stoned hippie jazz kids. We didn't play for dancers. We sat around looking cool, playing a little dives, and thinking we were the cat's ass. I mean, I didn't know even dance existed. I didn't know anything existed. In fact, I had an old I ran into an old girlfriend who said, "Man, what's your problem? All the girls wanted to date you, and all you wanted to do was play the piano." I said, if I had known that, things might have turned out different.
Yeah, but
Nonetheless,
you said that before we started recording today. Looking at all the boxes behind you, said all I wanted to do was play the piano.
that's all I wanted to do. And it wasn't just posing. I genuinely love this instrument. To this day, I get up and I look at that instrument and I'm filled with emotion. Just the privilege of being an instrumentalist, a composer, an educator. It does not fail to break my heart every day. What a beautiful and loving and obligation that is that I have. Yeah. So I never, and it's funny because I feel like a good large portion of my creative life was missing until I started working with dance. I started working with dance companies with Ballet Hispanico and Malpaso, Alvin Ailey. I just scored. I didn't score. I was commissioned by the San Francisco Ballet Company to write a full ballet. I just had it premiered in the ballet at the War Memorial Opera House. And I find that my work with choreographers and dancers has revolutionized the way that I play, the way that I compose, the way that I now understand that for me, music is architectural and visual. It's not just notes and harmony. I now have to see notes moving like bodies, and I have to hear chords like choreography, and I have to have compositional structures that are architectural, like a staged setting, and it really has freed me up. Here's the essential mystery of music: is that we are trying to capture freedom in amber. The composer is trying to capture the nuance of creation and set it down so that it can be replicated. That's a dichotomy. That's a real kind of across purposes. And so, in a way, one has to embrace the joy of codifying the moment of freedom, if you will. A composer sits down to write or perform, a pianist sits down to play and hopes to come up with something that's absolutely spontaneous and freedom and beautiful. But we've got the same 10 fingers, the same 12 notes, and the same repeated patterns that we all are privy to. So in a way, the way that I've learned to kind of capture the freedom of living both on both sides of ration and intuition is by looking at structure and finding that ballet, modern dance, is the ultimate expression of that living between ration and intuition. You can't get 18 musicians to do the same thing unless it's written down. So what you write down on paper has to come from a place of absolute spontaneity. How do you do that? How do you do that? And so I found that one of the ways that I do it is by referencing all of my work output to dance. Those dancers have to do that. Dancers have to work very rigorously to realize their art, because otherwise they'll injure themselves. They'll be bumping into one another. They'll be falling. There'll be mass mayhem. There'll be broken bones. And so, in a way, capturing that ineffable essence of freedom and instant spontaneous creation has to go through the process of codification. And so, to me, I've learned about looking from dance. I've learned how to look at music as movement, as staging, as architecture, as absolute, and the beauty of flight. The beauty of flight. when you see a dancer jump up in the air and do a move that they've practiced 1,000 times before, there is a moment at which they do have complete freedom. Now think about that mystery, about the mystery of doing something you've done 1,000 times before, and every time you do it, it's fresh and new and different in the slightest mechanism. Maybe the way you twirl your hand, maybe the way you come down on your feet, maybe the angle in which but that structure gives you the absolute key and entry point into freedom because you're doing something you've done 1,000 times before. You can play the blues the same way every single day, or you can play the blues in a brand new, miraculous fashion every single time. And I think dance to me has given me some of that understanding.
I wonder if there's a part of the music, if we separate the sections of music like the melody and the rhythm and the harmony, is there something when you're writing for dance that you do less of? For instance, because there's an audio and a visual, do you need to spend as much time and effort on the melodic quality of the music if people are dancing to it?
Interestingly enough, I did many projects where I was given video to score to. The most beautiful collaboration I just had with this Cuban choreographer from London who did the San Francisco Ballet Commission. And what was beautiful about it is we sat down for a week in my studio in UCLA and talked about the narrative and specifically designed characteristics for each of the players in the narrative so that all of a sudden I found myself literally planning and writing the music as the choreography was being created and imbuing it with very specific anthropomorphisms, characteristics of humanity, specific rhythms, specific pacing. And I found that really freeing because now, and this is this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's the San Francisco Ballet. Oh my God. It's hundreds of year old European tradition. And we're doing something and it was Carmen. It was a ballet version of Carmen. So we're doing now something that is maybe the most beloved opera piece in the entire history of opera, and with the most beloved dance form in the world, with one of the most. There were so many potential straitjackets placed upon me to do this ballet that you could not imagine, even to the point where the artistic director of the San Francisco Ballet was pushing me to use Bizet quotes. So, I mean, the straitjackets were coming at me from every direction, and yet I found it the most unbelievably free experience because the choreographer and I took time to really discover the characters, to really discover the music they generated. And so when I finally sat down to compose, there was a connection to the humanity of the piece that I don't get when I just look at a video of people dancing. And to me, that's always the thing the thing that always goads my artistry is the human narrative. I can't write abstract, pretty fast bebop. I can't do that. I have to write to a human narrative. There has to be some sort of connection to a cause, a people, a thought, a very specific. And in this case, in this particular version of Carmen, Carmen does not get killed. She doesn't get shot. She doesn't get stabbed. She doesn't run off with the lover. She doesn't run off with the husband. She doesn't return to her people. She takes off and becomes a sovereign human being filled with fear and trembling at the wonder of being sovereign. And so it's a radically different narrative than most of the times when you think about Carmen. And that was so exciting to me. It was so exciting to me to be able to de-victimize Carmen. It was so exciting to me to be able to say something positive about this human being who's, who's so chained down. So even as I'm writing this ballet with a fantastic ballet company and a fantastic symphony orchestra in a fantastic operatic setting, I found it incredibly freeing because I knew that with all these contraptions, with all these straitjackets, that I was only going to be able to be myself. That was the only way I was going to be able to do it authentically. And so I did some of my most, I think I did some of my most honest composition in the midst of this incredible architecture and incredible, it's just imagine that. And if you listen to it, I think you'll hear real Arturo music in a way that you won't hear on any other recordings.
Another Arturo, Sandoval, told me that he's been typecast in the film world. Yes, call on him if you need something Latino. And I wonder if the people that come to you for commissions, do they have that in their mind?
I think that the San Francisco Ballet Commission did, but I think a lot of the work that I get as a composer is strictly because of them wanting my sound, them wanting my approach. I did a composition for the NPR local station WNYC. They commissioned me to write a piece, and they put no such constraints on me. They just saw me as a modernist and that I could do whatever I want. They didn't ask for Latin music. Here's the thing that I was trying to get out earlier. I don't fit. I'm transculture. I'm transgenre. I don't fit. I'm not a jazz musician per se. I'm not a jazz composer. I'm not a jazz composer. I'm not a jazz pianist. I'm not a Latin composer. But I'm not those things. So in a way, the stuff that used to vex me when I was a young artist, that I wasn't recognized by this thing or that thing, I wasn't invited to play on this or that because I wasn't Black or white or Latino enough, all that stuff that used to vex me, really later on I saw as the biggest blessing of my life, because I didn't win this competition, because I didn't go to that school, because I didn't get this grant, or I didn't get this award, because I didn't fit into those narrow confines of this is what you do when you're a jazz musician, or this is, because I wasn't readily because I wasn't readily invited to this or that exclusive club. I actually got it, and it hurt me in the beginning of my life. I was very angry, but now looking back on, I realize that I have a wide view of the craft. I have a much wider vista. I don't see the things as defined by jazz or Latin or classical, or I don't see those divisions. I've actually been blessed to not be typecast into the Latin world, because the records, let's face it, of course, they're going to need to put you in the category. But the Cornell West Concerto, 4 questions, I don't think so. The Offense of the Drum, I don't think so. None of that stuff. And in fact, not much to my surprise, a lot of my Latin brethren do not embrace me because I don't play safe-sex mambos. I don't write safe-sex mambos. I write obstinate music that insists that the source material is common to all of us.
In your big band writing versus music for the dance, have you ever noticed that we depend sometimes on open solos, solo sections for individuals, music wise, but also because they stretch out a composition? In the small instances where I've tried to write something, I'll use the word classical, it's alarming sometimes how much time you put into it, and you play it and you've got 45 seconds so far. And you feel like, okay, give it to the soloist, stretch it out. Is that an issue for you?
No, it's never been. As a matter of fact, for me, I like, without formally knowing this, I adopted the Ellingtonian model of understanding that the improvisation is an orchestrational compositional tool, not a chance to stretch a piece. In fact, I've committed the cardinal sin of writing jazz pieces where there is no improvisation. So, that doesn't go so well with the downbeat crowd, but it works for me. I feel like I've written pieces where the improvisation must be utilitarian. It has to be, and I'm a lot like Duke in that I write specifically for the musicians in my orchestra. I know who's gonna sound like Lee Morgan. I know who's gonna sound like Eric Dolphy. And so I will write solos into those parts because I want that flavor and I want that. This I learned, by the way, again from Carla Bley. Carla Bley uh, wrote for her musicians. I saw it up close. She wrote for Gary Valente. She wrote for me. She wrote specifically, and this I love about Carla. So she would use the voice of the soloist as an orchestrational compositional tool. She would also use genre as an orchestral as a compositional tool. If she thought that a piece needed some minimalism, she would stick it in there. If she thought a piece needed some humor, she would stick it in there. And it was something that really blew me away. That composition is there's so many things that people use. It's not just about drop five voicing for the saxophones in the soli. That's not what it is. What it is using every tool at your convenience to communicate a larger truth. And that's where I think a lot of times we go wrong. We just write music. I think music is secondary to the larger mission, which is to build community and to convey meaning.
with a groove.
Yeah. In fact, nothing is more important than the groove. My kids, when they were growing up, I terrorized them because I would literally look at them out of the blue and I'd say, "What's more important than the groove?" And they'd look at me and go, "Nothing." We had T-shirts made up during the pandemic. I don't know if you know anything about this, but I have a whole I started a nonprofit 17 years ago called the Afro Latin Jazz Alliance, which is now called Belongo. In fact, we're about to break ground on a community performing arts center in Harlem that's going to be part of an affordable housing building. But we've literally changed the conversation about this music. Before we existed, Afro Latin jazz wasn't even part of the lexicon. But in the 17 years that we've existed, we've done incredible work bringing music into the schools. We've actually got 47 teaching artists in 21 New York City school districts. We have a pre-professional training program. We've created a whole international touring performing presence with award-winning music by incredible orchestras, and all of that really is in the service of humanity, in the service of creating community. So for me, the biggest joy in my life is not having recognition, but using music as a way to bring human beings together to live meaningful, productive lives with dignity and grace. And that has been the biggest joy of my life, to see the family. I went to Birdland last night and did the first set, and the second set, a board member came, and we're trying to raise millions of dollars to build this thing. So I sat with my board member for the second set and let our associate artistic director play the piano and do the speaking. And my associate artistic director, I met when he was 12 years old, and he was a protege of not Billy Taylor. Barry Harris. He was a protege of Barry Harris, and he became part of my world, and he became part of my pre-professional training program, the Fat Cats. And over the years, then he went on to get a full scholarship to the NYU the School of Jazz, and so I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at him leading the band, which is now very intergenerational. I have yearly auditions. I keep a floating tab of musicians that are women, diverse, young, old. I mean, and I'm looking at this band, I'm looking at a very diverse band of women, older, younger, Asian, black, green, red. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, man, I've run a good race. I'm so proud of the fact that I've changed, even if nobody pays attention. I've changed the dynamic for how this thing is dealt with. I've changed the dynamic for how this conversation about our music is had.
Makes me think of the phrase you ended your Grammy acceptance speech with in 2015. And you said, love is the only currency we have.
It's the only currency of value. It really is. The only thing that matters is not how you live, where you live. I mean, those are all things that are important. Let's face it. We're failing. America's failing to provide the most basic living wages for human beings and decent places. I mean, we are, but at the end of the day, your value is not what car you drive. Your value is not what penthouse you live in or what cardboard box you live in. Your value is whom have you loved, truly loved, and who has loved you? Who has appreciated your sovereignty, your humanity, your individuality, and whom have you loved and accepted? Those are the things that our lives are measured by. And so if you can use your creative practice to gain to give the biggest platform for humanity to exist, then you've done a good thing.
If I don't ask this, I'm going to wonder later on. You've used the word sovereignty a few times. Can you enlighten me on what that means to you?
What that means to me is that I don't have to adhere to structures that are foisted upon me. The whole idea of being a musician was a choice. It was a willful one. I was exposed to music through my father, but I fell in love with Herbie Hancock. I chose to do music I love, regardless of what the paycheck is. My father didn't. My father struggled with creating a commercial music house for jingles. I've chosen to be who I am, to engage in conversations about racial, ethnic identity, physical identity, sexual identity. I've chosen to be a person who respects the rights of human beings to define themselves by whatever means they can and to respect it, because the identity politics is so important. Who are you? Where do you come from? Where are you going? What do you look at yourself as? And all human beings deserve the dignity to define themselves in the way they feel comfortable. This is so central to me because as a transcultural German, Cuban, Irish, Mexican, who with a propensity for the avant-garde, I haven't always been accorded the same conduits that many others have been. But I created my own reality. I created my own vehicle. I created my own career. I created my own struggles and defined myself by what I thought was important. And it's very simple. It's important to demystify elitism. It's important that people of Hispanic descent are given the opportunity to tell their story in our music. And it's important to use music to use music as a vehicle to bring betterment for others. Those are the three issues in my life that I've tried to live by.
Wonderful. I'll wrap up with just two brief things. I wanted to just make a comment on how wonderful I thought it was that you were able to return to Cuba and put your father to rest there.
That was my father would only cry about one thing. My father would only cry when he remembered his childhood in Vedado, in Varadero, in Cuba. It was the only thing that I ever saw make him cry. And the beaches, the landscape of Cuba, and it is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous island. And so he was never able to return. He died without ever having. He was offered the opportunity to return, but he was afraid of the Miami Cubans, uh, uh, you know, ruining his career, something like that. I think he was scared too, but he was never able to return. So to be able to bring my mother and father to be buried in the National Cemetery in Havana was just a magical moment for me. I mean, it was just a personal. It meant nothing to society. It meant nothing to the world. But for me, as a son, it was a filial duty that I had to carry out.
In your bio, one of them, there's a brief thing about you being in 1979 in an upstate New York bar and noticed by jazz pianist Carla Blake. I wonder if you can tell me what the upstate bar was, because I live in upstate New York.
I bet you it's not there. Do you know Willow, New York? Willow, New York is a little hamlet, like I want to say 20 minutes from Woodstock.
Okay.
It's basically a post office. It's basically where Carla had her home. Her home was in Willow, and there was the post office and a bar, and the bar was called Billy Trips. And we were just kids. I told you before, we were just pot smoking hippie jazz kids, and all we wanted to do was play. And somehow we found a way. My friend had a house on Route 212 outside of Willow, and his parents had a house there. And so we found ourselves with a gig at this bar, and Carla Bley was one of the people. And it's funny how you don't think about the things in your life that Carla Bley went on to have such a huge role in my life. I cried like a baby when she died.
You've come a long way.
Thank you. I've tried. I've tried to be of service.
I thank you for your time today, Arturo. It's been
My pleasure.
very
My pleasure,
profound.
Monk.
And
I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
all right. I hope we cross paths sometime.
I would love that. That would mean the world to me.
Okay.
Take care.